For over 5,000 years, video games have been at the heart of our society and way of life. Empires rose and fell, cultures waxed and waned, flavors of Mountain Dew were released, then retired. Video games are literally the most important thing in the known universe, but until now, there has been no show grand enough, no award monumental enough to truly honor them. Until now. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my esteemed privilege to present to you the first Arbitrary Video Game Awards. Dear Lord, imagine if anything took itself that seriously. Now, the Arbitrary Video Game Awards, ladies and gentlemen, it's simple as that. I pick stuff in categories. There was no panel of judges, there were no prizes to be won. I would simply like to highlight some pretty cool stuff that happened this year, and occasionally, some companies and products that really messed up. The categories are purely arbitrary. The nominations are purely arbitrary. And of course, the winners are purely arbitrary. But I will at least make some effort to explain the choices and to celebrate the winner. That's about as much as I can promise you here at the Arbitrary Awards. There is no physical trophy, but we do have a wonderful trophy of the imagination, which can of course be absolutely anything your heart desires, as long as that desire is entirely ineffable and not in any way costly to me. Perhaps you'd like to know what categories we have here at the Arbitrary Awards. We have every category you can imagine, as long as those categories happen to be the ones on the list. We have Best Soundtrack, Best Thing to Come Out of Crowdfunding, Most Interesting Gaming YouTube Channel That Isn't Mine, the Stop Pre-Ordering Video Games Award for Biggest Launch Disaster, Most Impressive Aesthetic, Best Expansion and DLC Content, Best Mobile Game, the game I turned my consoles on for the most this year, the game that most surpassed my expectations, the Sharpened Pitchfork Award for Dodgiest Games Company of the Year, and of course, the game that most needs to see the light of GabeN with a PC port. Let us begin, shall we, with nominations for Best Soundtrack. Best Soundtrack. The nominations for Best Soundtrack are Shovel Knight. This thoroughly 8-bit inspired soundtrack is brought to you by Jake Kaufman, the fellow behind Shantae and the Pirate's Curse, Double Dragon Neon, Mighty Switch Force, Red Faction Guerrilla, and many more games besides. Despite its deliberately limited fidelity, the Shovel Knight soundtrack is both imaginative and extremely fun to listen to. Reminiscent of 2D platforming classics of old, the Shovel Knight soundtrack is packed with classic tune after classic tune, all of them driving you towards your destination and demanding that you strike the earth and do battle for chivalry on this one fateful night. Transistor by Darren Korb. This is a composer that hasn't worked on too many games, but he did create one of my favorite soundtracks over the last few years, and that is of course from the game Bastion, also produced by Supergiant, the studio behind Transistor. While Bastion's soundtrack was absolutely phenomenal, the addition of many vocal tracks by Ashley Barrett, as well as hauntingly beautiful humming parts, make the Transistor soundtrack truly something unique and very special in 2014. Crypt of the Necrodancer. The name Darren Baranowski, aka Danny B, should be fairly familiar to you if you happen to like either Binding of Isaac or Super Meat Boy, perhaps the two soundtracks he is best known for, although he has collaborated on a number of different projects besides. Crypt of the Necrodancer needed a good soundtrack to be a decent game. It is, of course, a rhythm-based roguelike, and thankfully Danny B provides the pumping soundtrack to one of the more unusual titles this year, a game which, as far as I'm concerned, is partially responsible for online embarrassment and almost breaking my ankles. Persona Q. The soundtrack to this game was composed by Atsushi Kitajo and Toshiki Kanishi. A melding of previous Persona titles by two very experienced composers. Both are responsible for work on various Persona games as well as Devil Survivor, as well as the game Catherine. Those who have played the previous Persona titles are going to find a lot to like here, as the soundtracks of both Persona 3 and 4 are well represented with various interesting fusions and mashups. The Persona series is well known for its music, so much so in fact that a dancing game based on Persona 4 is in development. Persona Q does not disappoint in the music department. Wolfenstein: The New Order. This is a nominee for two reasons. One, due to the excellent work of Mick Gordon, the composer behind games such as the new Killer Instinct, Shootmania, and Need for Speed: The Run. The in-game soundtrack for this particular title is absolutely fantastic and punctuates the high action. However, what's perhaps even more interesting is the inclusion of various alternate history versions of classic songs. Collaborations of various artists were able to put together records by the fictional Numond Recording Company, which you can find as collectibles throughout the game. Perhaps the most well-known was used in an advertising campaign for the title, a German version of House of the Rising Sun. This is the part where I'm supposed to arbitrarily say and the winner is, isn't it? Well, I'm not really going to do that, because I'd like to talk a little bit more about my choices before I decide to pick the winner. It's a really hard category to choose between, because each one of these soundtracks has their own individual merits. Some of them are just plain fun, like Crypt of the Necrodancer. Others are very haunting, such as Transistor. There's a great amount of variety there, and that's just in the 5 soundtracks that I've shortlisted. There have been plenty of games that came out this year with phenomenal music, and I'm glad to see that composers are getting greater recognition these days, with improved sales of official soundtracks available via various digital distribution platforms, as well as plenty of good intention sharing by gamers through Twitch streams as well as YouTube videos. I certainly hope that we continue in 2015 to move towards a place where game music is truly considered to be worthwhile in its own right and can stand alone as something worthy of purchase. I think that we've certainly reached that point, and I want it to continue to grow. That said, we are going to have to pick a winner, and the winner for Best Soundtrack of 2014 is Darren Korb's Transistor. I remember the haunting outro song from Bastion, and then I remember that Transistor contains several tracks of that level of quality, things that are absolutely beautiful and yet forlorn and sad. But there's a great amount of variety within Darren Korb's soundtrack. From perhaps the more well-known track The Spine, which could have frankly been a top 40 hit in its own right, to the much-needed light-hearted break of Coasting. This soundtrack really does have it all. It's eminently listenable, masterfully put together, and with the additions of the vocals of Ashley Barrett, an absolutely beautiful experience. The Transistor soundtrack is, at least in my view, the best soundtrack of 2014. Best thing to come out of crowdfunding. The nominations for the best thing to come out of crowdfunding are as follows. Xenonauts by Goldhawk Interactive, which raised $154,715 of its original $50,000 goal. The creation of Xenonauts began years ago when it appeared that there was no chance of a modern revival of the XCOM Enemy Unknown series. In the development time that it took to bring Xenonauts to life, we in fact had the release of not only XCOM Enemy Unknown by Firaxis, a reimagining of the original title with a modern twist, but also an expansion, XCOM Enemy Within. Undaunted, however, Goldhawk Interactive continued to work on Xenonauts thanks to a large influx of crowdfunding, and eventually completed the title, which is a very faithful reproduction of the original. Those looking for a more strategic and in-depth experience, as opposed to the more modernized XCOM Enemy Unknown, will certainly find it here. Shovel Knight by Yacht Club. It raised $311,502 with an original $75,000 goal. Shovel Knight makes yet another well-deserved entry into the nominees list for a very good reason. Yes, it has a great soundtrack, but it also has absolutely exceptional gameplay. It's a platformer on the level of the very best, both 8 and 16-bit platformers of yesteryear. This is an example of a game that perhaps would have had difficulty being developed were it not for Kickstarter, and yet 8-bit platformers are to a penny on that particular service. What made Shovel Knight so special? Well, its excellent presentation and fantastic characterization probably helped it a great deal. It had its own personality coming right out of the gate, and it made a promise to be faithful to its 8-bit ancestors, and it succeeded in doing just that, and created a compelling experience. It proved that some design philosophies are indeed timeless, And thanks to crowdfunding, this wonderful game, which feels out of place, out of time, and yet completely relevant in 2014, is now available for purchase. Tex Murphy, The Tesla Effect by Big Finish Games. This raised just over its $450,000 goal with $598,104. This game was not the biggest Kickstarter success, it wasn't even the biggest critical success. It is overshadowed by many other titles, but it's on this list for one reason. This game had absolutely no chance of being made without Kickstarter and crowdfunding, because it's effectively a dead genre. This is an FMV game. Those kind of titles are simply not made anymore. Back in the day, when CD-ROMs were first becoming relevant to gaming, they were generally packed full of full-motion video. That's what was filling the disc. This allowed for not only significant advances in cutscenes, but it also created entire new genres that were reliant on full-motion video. This more often than not created a somewhat B-movie experience, and Tex Murphy embraced that. It always had a very quirky sense of humor, and the Tesla Effect brings that sense of humor back with slightly more modern technology, only slightly, and it stands as a unique testament to a dead genre in 2014, and yet it was exactly, I think, what the fans of that genre were looking for. The thing about Kickstarter is you don't have to sell hundreds of thousands or millions of copies to be successful. You're making a product for a niche audience that is willing to pay for it, and that's exactly what Tex Murphy, The Tesla Effect succeeds in being. The Banner Saga by Stoic. This raised a massive $723,886 with an initial goal of just $100,000. This is a great success story because it created a beautiful title using rotoscope-style animation, something we, again, generally don't see anymore, a technique of a bygone age. The Banner Saga's development is the story of former AAAs coming together to make a small personal project that they really cared about, and Kickstarter enabled them to do just that. In its own right, it's a fantastic tactical RPG with some Oregon Trail and a little bit of Telltale Games thrown in there for good measure. It was rightfully criticized for its somewhat abrupt ending, but the journey was so enjoyable that the destination became something of an afterthought. The success of the Banner Saga has allowed them to continue it, with the Banner Saga 2 having been recently announced at Jeff Keighley's Game Awards. Wasteland 2 by inXile, raising a staggering $2.93 million with an initial lofty goal of $900,000. Of all the projects that I've listed, this was no doubt the most ambitious, a full-length classic CRPG by folks that have brought you many in the past, but with perhaps much larger studios and in a somewhat different time where things just cost less money. Regardless, the sequel to the 80s game Wasteland, which many people don't remember but was in fact the inspiration to Fallout, was a lofty project, to say the least. With something that large and complex, it could have very easily gone wrong in a myriad of different ways. However, the game was delivered to the satisfaction of many and is one of several titles in 2014 that really bring back the classic style of CRPG. Before we talk about the winner of this category, I'd like to talk about the category itself once again. Kickstarter seems to be going in an unfortunate direction. It's becoming harder and harder for games to get the funding. We're seeing more and more high-profile failures, which unfortunately seem to be spurred on by some of the failures from the last few years. Games that were funded and yet never actually came out, or came out in a much, much poorer state than what was promised in the first place. It does really seem like the crowdfunding bubble has burst. It's unlikely that we'll ever see a success as large as something like Tides of Numenera, or of course the Titanic Star Citizen ever again. And that's something of a shame, because amongst those high-profile failures and disappointments, we do have plenty of titles that, were it not for Kickstarter, probably would have never seen the light of day. Especially the winner of this category, the largest game in it, Wasteland 2. Every game in this category, and many more besides, deserve recognition and accolades simply for being able to come out of the turbulent world of crowdfunding, where even some of the most experienced developers have managed to squander said funding, and in doing so have shaken the trust of both their backers as well as the market in general. But Wasteland 2 developed a game of the scale that they promised. It was certainly delayed, there's no doubt about that, but it delivered exactly what I, as a fairly major backer of this game, wanted. Full disclosure, I did put $1,000 into this. In fact, I backed several games on this list, but Wasteland 2 delivered for me. I've been slowly playing through it for the last few months, just dipping in every now and again, and it's delivered great writing, excellent depth, fun questing, fun, meaningful, contextual questing in the style of old CRPGs. It's story-driven, and yet a lot of it is really done through the gameplay's narrative as opposed to just throwing a bunch of words at you. It has some systems which, frankly, have no place in modern games, and yet somehow work, such as the ability to type in random words into the interface and occasionally unlock new dialogue options as a direct result of that. It melds elements of old-school interactive fiction with a modern title that has a distinct CRPG spin on it. I mean, this really does feel like Fallout 4 if Fallout were to go back to its roots. It really did deliver exactly what I wanted from a project. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm very, very happy that I backed it, and equally happy that I promoted it back in the day, even if perhaps looking back on it, that might not have been the best idea. Thankfully, for my sake and for the sake of my credibility, it was a success, it was a critical hit, and as far as I'm concerned, it's the best thing to come out of crowdfunding in 2014. Most interesting gaming YouTube channel that isn't mine. The nominations for the most interesting gaming YouTube channel that isn't mine are as follows. Xbox Ahoy! What started off as a channel which was really little more than a Call of Duty weapons guide has transformed into something really, really interesting. The channel runs a series called Iconic Arms, which is a documentary-style presentation about the representation and history of various firearms in video games. They also produced a very detailed 5-part history of computer graphics, as well as some absolutely intriguing niche retrospective videos such as Doomed, The Embers of Amiga FPS. Captained by the sultry tones of a British narrator, Xbox Ahoy is one of those channels where you should simply ignore the name and look at the content.
Two principal paradigms for rendering an image on the screen.
Jim Sterling. If there was an award for most handsome man in video games, Jim Sterling would surely be a shoo-in. However, due to my own personal self-esteem problems, that category is not present this year. Jim Sterling has made a fairly remarkable transition from traditional games media to the new media, whatever that means, creating YouTube content based on some bloody terrible video games, and recently transferring his successful series The Jimquisition from The Escapist to a Patreon-funded, ad-free model over on his YouTube channel. A good friend of mine and peer for quite some time, Jim Sterling has a somewhat inimitable sense of humor. Never before has the term Jizzy Bears been uttered from the mouth of a games reviewer, and I doubt we will ever see its like again.
They're not banned, just like Captain Rainbow.
Super Bunny Hop. Again, one of those fairly unfortunate names, I suppose, that really doesn't necessarily represent the content of the channel, but Super Bunny Hop is, for the most part, a games reviewer, with occasional editorial content that is often fairly interesting. His investigation into gaming beyond 60 frames per second was certainly good to show those that don't really understand the difference. He's got plenty of interesting interviews on his channel, and I really enjoy his reviewing style. It eloquently straddles the line between the consumer buyer's guide style of review and academic critique, and it doesn't go too far off either end. I think it really helps that George actually has the intelligence and the academic background to create journalistic content. Plenty of people try it, and most people don't really succeed. Thankfully, George does, and as a result, his channel remains relevant and informative.
It's a shame because
VartyVidya. I don't play Dark Souls, at least not on a regular basis, so if someone can explain to me exactly why it is that I watch everything Varty puts out, I would be very interested in hearing it. Now, I think I can identify it quite well. It's a very unique channel. It's something that combines creative writing with the lore of a very vague universe, something that is not particularly well explained and is really very open to interpretation. Thankfully, Varty is very good at interpretation. I have no doubt that some of this stuff is merely a flight of fancy and isn't actually accurate, but That's the point of Souls, isn't it? It doesn't necessarily have to be. A lot of this stuff really isn't canon. It's a very confusing universe, and Varty does an incredibly good job of explaining exactly what's going on and crafting what is often a very sad and forlorn story. Regardless of whether or not I actually play the game, the universe of the Souls series is very interesting to me, and Varty does a peerless job of exemplifying exactly why that is.
Converting the cops to a hunting ground and prison.
Mathematosis. If you want a channel that does incredibly in-depth critiques, often of fairly old titles, and is not afraid to skewer the occasional sacred cow or two, then Mathematosis does that really, really well. I first stumbled across his videos perhaps in the same way that many did by watching his Dark Souls 2 critique, which brought up many, many points from the perspective of someone who is clearly an expert at the game that I personally wouldn't have considered. It was incredibly in-depth, and I didn't feel like it was treading over the same ground over and over and over again. I think Mathematosis does an incredible job of creating some really thought-provoking videos. He hasn't made a lot of them, but I certainly hope that he continues to do so. Even on games that, frankly, I'm not actually that interested in, I still manage to find some intriguing points that I otherwise wouldn't have considered, some nice little factoids here and there, or just a little bit of insight that goes beneath the surface.
Most of the boss battles do share one thing in
Gaming content on YouTube is clearly not slowing down. In fact, I would say that it is more diverse than ever. Don't get me wrong, there's certainly been more than one occasion when I've looked at the same kind of content over and over again, and people trying to imitate what is already successful, and just kind of despaired and thought to myself, is this really what we're going to be doing for the next year on YouTube? And it turns out, no, actually it's not. We're in a pretty good place, and by the sounds of it, Google is realizing exactly how important gaming content is on its network and moving to further support it, which, as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely fantastic. The onset of YouTube content has changed the way that we approach both video games and the media surrounding it, and for the most part, I think that's actually been for the better. It's resulted in a rather unique platform with a huge potential audience that has allowed indie titles, which otherwise would have really never seen success at all, to become blockbusters in their own right, entirely through this accessible form of everyman's media, and for the most part, that's a very good thing indeed, although there are still plenty of problems, ethical issues that we as YouTubers have to work through. All of that said, the winner for the most interesting gaming YouTube channel that is mine, as far as I'm concerned, is Xbox Ahoy. Out of all of the channels I've listed, all of which I enjoy on a daily basis, I'd have to say that Xbox Ahoy's production quality has blown me away. Excellent, excellent narration, really great writing, and fantastic use of visuals. Not overdoing it, picking the right pieces of footage, and just making a really professional-looking product that really wouldn't look out of place on television. The Iconic Arms series is incredibly interesting, but I was really intrigued by those niche videos. The Amiga FPS video was absolutely fascinating to me because I never owned an Amiga. I didn't really know anything about the Amiga gaming scene, or indeed what had happened in regards to Amiga versus PC, and that video gave me a good insight into that. So I certainly hope that Xbox Ahoy continues to be successful with these in-depth videos, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a channel that you should all consider subscribing to. The Stop Pre-Ordering Video Games Award for Biggest Launch Disaster. The nominees for the Stop Pre-Ordering Video Games Award are as follows. Assassin's Creed Unity. Honestly, Ubisoft has had a really, really bad year, but I think it is exemplified by its highest profile failure, Assassin's Creed Unity. A massive game, a huge, hyped, high-budget title, one of the most expensive games, no doubt, ever made, and it was launched in an incredibly poor state. Both on console and PC, this game ran terribly. Essential functionality just didn't work. The frame rate on all machines was far lower than it should have been. The game was plagued by crashes, riddled with microtransactions. Its much vaunted crowd size seemed to only lead to problems as AI NPC actors did ridiculous things, clipped through walls, through each other, disappeared at random due to the game's ridiculous pop-in. The game's horrendous launch actually correlated with a drop in Ubisoft stock prices. As a show of contrition, Ubisoft cancelled the Season Pass and offered the major piece of DLC expansion content for free. Even it realized just how terrible a launch Assassin's Creed Unity was. This game is the crown jewel of high-profile failures this year for Ubisoft. Halo, the Master Chief Collection. This game should have been an absolute slam dunk. It is a moneymaker. It is a cash cow waiting to be milked. Remastering a series of ridiculously successful games and bringing them to a system which doesn't have any ridiculously successful games. Many have argued that the release of the Master Chief Collection has made the Xbox One competitive again in several markets. Indeed, the Xbox One is outselling the PlayStation 4 in the UK at this very moment. And yet, regardless of the glowing reviews, very little mention was given to the disastrous multiplayer component, the main meat, one would imagine, of a remastered Halo collection. Over a month after launch, the game still has ridiculous matchmaking problems. For weeks, it was almost impossible to get into a multiplayer match, and even if you did, it was often lopsided, and if people dropped from the game, which they more often than not did, it wasn't possible for people to join to take their place, so you ended up with a lopsided waste of time. Bonnie Ross, the head of 343 Studios, issued a public apology about this particular issue. It should have been easy. It should have been a simple moneymaker, but from a multiplayer perspective, Halo Master Chief Collection launched in a disastrous state. Watch Dogs. Ubisoft's second entry to the list of biggest launch disasters, Watch Dogs was the most highly anticipated title of the year, based on years of pre-release hype and an incredibly impressive showing at E3. What did we get? Well, a massive visual downgrade and huge performance problems on PC, tied into several days of being unable to play the game due to Ubisoft's Uplay system falling flat on its arse for the umpteenth time. As seems to be the main curse of Ubisoft titles this year, it was plagued by ridiculous pop-in and performance problems on PC. To make matters even worse, it was suspected that Ubisoft deliberately downgraded the PC version. The reason for that? Again, no one really knows. It's pure speculation, but modders were able to tinker in the code and enable effects that were present yet not enabled for no seemingly apparent and obvious reason. Not only that, but for some people, enabling these effects actually improved the game's performance, which really does make me scratch my head. The messy launch of Watch Dogs took all the wind out of the hype sails, and frankly, most people seem to have forgotten it even released this year at this point. Warlords of Draenor. Well, we're certainly no stranger to Blizzard launch problems, particularly if it involves an online service. Diablo 3 had problems, Hearthstone has had problems several times already, and I'm sure if Heroes of the Storm were released at some point this year, it probably would have suffered from the same fate. Unfortunately, those are all dwarfed by Warlords of Draenor's disastrous launch. After several expansions, one would think that things would be smoothed out, but according to Blizzard, a sudden surge in interest, most likely due to their largest marketing campaign in history for the game, resulted in the servers being overloaded and massive queues for thousands and thousands of people for hours and hours at a time. Eventually things got sorted out, but I will say this for certain, and perhaps this is personal bias talking, but this is indeed the Arbitrary Awards where such things are not only allowed but encouraged, but Lord, the family strife, Blizzard, you caused in my household due to the delays and the problems with Warlords of Draenor, oh, you have a lot to answer for. That is one angry, angry wife. Drive Club. This PlayStation 4 racing game was supposed to be a launch title for the system and has already been significantly delayed. However, upon its final release, Drive Club ran into gigantic PlayStation Network issues. For weeks after launch, many of the game's features were crippled or completely unusable due to server problems wrecking online connectivity. And while the game could be played offline, the whole point of Drive Club is to join a driving club, all of which of course is driven by the online experience. This forced the president of the studio to apologize and caused the release of the free PlayStation Network version, which was designed to vastly increase the population of the game, to be put on hold due to the fact that they didn't believe the servers could handle it. You know, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I seem to be noticing something of a common theme when it comes to launch disasters, and that may very well be the always online component. This year has been something of a mess for game launches. I think this has been the year which has truly exemplified the axiom of do not pre-order video games. I can think of 10 more titles that could have gone on that list. And there are plenty, I imagine, that you're thinking, well, why is that not in there? It's simply because they weren't as bad as the ones that I've shortlisted here. A lot of problems have been associated with servers on the company's end and always online DRM or account-based functionality. The problems with this system are obvious, and they are repeatedly ruining gamers' experiences. The number of high-profile, huge budget releases that have come out in an incomplete state is absolutely deplorable. This has got to have been one of the worst years for that kind of thing, and I'm really hoping that consumers start to wise up to this and actively avoid pre-ordering these titles. Just wait. We've even seen games media sites adapt to this, realizing, well, these multiplayer launch events that we get to review the game at, well, they're not accurate. They're not reflective of the actual user experience, and all of us are starting to get a little bit savvy to that, and we are waiting, and we certainly hope that you will too, to see what kind of things a game has to offer before putting your money down. It's become abundantly clear that we cannot trust publishers to release a high-quality finished product in 2014, so indeed caveat emptor, as out-of-date an axiom as that may be. Regardless, the Stop Pre-Ordering Video Games Award for Biggest Launch Disaster goes to Halo the Master Chief Collection. This was an incredibly close one. This could have very easily gone to Unity or Draenor, probably not to Watch Dogs. I mean, it was pretty bad, but wasn't as bad as Unity. The thing is, the Master Chief Collection goes above and beyond that in several ways. Having the multiplayer component so completely broken for such a long period of time is absolutely unacceptable. Halo is, of course, legendary for its multiplayer mode, and no doubt many people were really looking to dive right back in and experience their childhood once again, and they weren't able to do that. There were people that took days off work to play with their friends, and they weren't able to do that either. And what's really annoying about it is, for the most part, in the reviews, this was completely whitewashed. Most of the reviews of the multiplayer came from a review event where everything worked absolutely fine in a small, controlled environment, and that was not reflective at all of the final product. The reviews ended up being highly misleading. This game, regardless of the fact that its main feature was fundamentally broken, sits at a healthy 86% on Metacritic. And if that isn't an absolute condemnation of both the scoring system and the way that games are reviewed in 2014, I don't know what is. Most Impressive Aesthetic. The nominations for Most Impressive Aesthetic are as follows. Transistor. If the first game by Supergiant, Bastion, had been released this year, it would have found itself on this list as well, but Transistor, as far as I'm concerned, is even more impressive than that. It is absolutely gorgeous. Created primarily by artist Gen Z, this game is a riot of color. It's an impressive take on the idea of cyberpunk. It's absolutely gorgeous in almost every respect. The character design, both for the enemies and of course the main character and agents of the Camarilla, are all absolutely spot on. It's reasonably hard to critique art style, especially for me. I'm not exactly an artist myself. All I know is that Transistor was just as enchanting, if not more so, than Bastion, and that was an absolutely beautiful game indeed. The Vanishing of Ethan Carter. This is a game that deserves recognition for both its aesthetic and its technical achievements. Some of the highest quality texture work that I've seen in a video game to date. Some of the most accurate representations of architecture and geography that I've ever seen, thanks to their 3D scanning method that they use to actually create this stuff. If you look at some of the screenshots of Ethan Carter, you can very easily mistake them for real life. The technique that they actually used goes by the name of photogrammetry. It's not a new technique. I mean, hell, it's been around since photography first existed, but the level of accuracy they managed to get with this was unbelievable. And it is one of the best looking games on PC. It's a phenomenal technical achievement for a small indie studio. It blows most games out of the water in terms of its graphical fidelity. And of course, it is haunting and creepy in all the right ways for this supernatural detective game. Abyss Odyssey. Ace Team is responsible for Abyss Odyssey, and they've never shied away from odd art styles, I have to say. Their previous titles, such as Rock of Ages, which took upon itself to try and emulate a somewhat Monty Python-esque way of going about things, and then their previous games, Xenoclash and Xenoclash 2, had some very strange examples of both architecture and character design, some really weird-looking stuff. Abyss Odyssey is perhaps a little bit less crazy than all of those games, but it manages to be the most beautiful game they've made to date by emulating the Art Nouveau movement in its aesthetic. It uses some fairly muted pastel colors, and in particular has some very impressive enemy and background design. It's in fact the backgrounds that blew me away the most. They have a surprising amount of depth behind them and really add to the complexity of the scene without making it more difficult to engage in the combat system. Abyss Odyssey is a gorgeous looking game, and I certainly hope that we see more of the artistic creativity from Ace Team going forward. The Banner Saga. I mentioned this game earlier, and its rotoscope style of animation is absolutely unique in the current glut of games that we happen to have on the market. The best way I could describe the aesthetic for this game is that it likes to do more with less. The cutscenes and conversations in particular are for the most part still images with very small animated details. And somehow that really works. The animation in the battles seems unusual when you first look at it. It's very stylized, distinctly non-traditional. Strangely, it might come back to that philosophy of less is more. The actual number of frames in each of the animations appears to be fairly low, which usually would be something that you would criticize, and yet somehow it works with the Banner Saga, simply because the whole aesthetic is consistent. It's well tied together, and it's meant to evoke memories of rotoscoped animations of old. It does so in a very enjoyable way indeed. Something very unique for your monitors this year. South Park, The Stick of Truth. I think it's impossible to do an award for aesthetic and not mention South Park, The Stick of Truth, because this is the game that managed to make something look exactly like a South Park episode. Exactly. I mean, you could very easily mistake it. It's that accurate when it comes to replicating the animation style and the aesthetic. It's the animation that's perhaps more important than the aesthetic here, the overall graphical fidelity, because that's perhaps the most distinct part of South Park. The way that the characters waddle and move around is very distinct. It's something that you don't see in other animations. And of course, they had to translate that to a video game with action sequences and combat, and they did so absolutely perfectly. I feel that if you were going to watch that fight in the cartoon, it would exactly replicate what you see in the game, and that is somewhat impressive. It did result in the game being locked to 30 frames per second, which is a little bit irritating, but there aren't that many good licensed games. There are certainly far, far fewer that manage to emulate the aesthetic of their source material so perfectly. It's to the point where I simply cannot think of another licensed title that's managed to pull that off, and that is very impressive indeed. The subject of aesthetic is always going to be a very subjective one. Some people love the look of games that others absolutely hate, and arguments over graphics tend to spring up, and graphics is such a generic term that is unfortunately of little use in 2014. I mean, we could talk about the technical fidelity of certain titles, we can talk about texture quality, we can talk about the effectiveness of anti-aliasing, we can talk about the merits of motion blur, we can do all of those things, but what really interests me these days is the aesthetic and the deliberate art design choices put into place, and how well it all ties together into something coherent. As indie titles in particular manage to climb out of the stereotype of merely being 8 or 16-bit retro pixel art aesthetics, we are getting a wide variety of really interesting art styles, and more talented people seem to be getting involved in creating them, and that should absolutely be applauded. There are many more games that could have very easily been shortlisted in this category, but there's one, to me at any rate, that stands above all of the others, who are still all equally impressive in their own right. This one, just a little bit more so. That, to me, has got to be Transistor, for the second time in this show. And well-deserved as far as I'm concerned. What a beautiful, what a gorgeous world that they created there with Transistor. What an amazing use of neon in that game. What a striking color palette. We're talking about a game that looks as good as its concept art, for God's sake, and that is ridiculously unusual. It's a world that could have felt very cold, very metallic, very cybernetic, and that would have made sense considering the subject matter, and yet it feels very vibrant. How does it do that when you are effectively so very alone in that game, when there are so few humans to actually interact with? Well, again, it's the aesthetic, it's the art style that really makes it feel alive, despite being surprisingly devoid of human contact. It's a universe that I would like to explore in greater detail. It was something that I was kind of sad to let go of when I finished the game. I would love to enter these buildings. I'd love to see who lives there. I'd love to experience the culture, which was well conveyed, again, through the aesthetic. Gen Z is just so phenomenally talented, and I dearly hope that she is able to continue to work on video games for a very long time to come. We'd be losing an incredible talent if she decided to go elsewhere. Best expansion content. The nominees for Best Expansion Content are Hearthstone, Goblins vs. Gnomes. Hearthstone has been starved for content for ages. A successful launch was followed by very little when it came to content releases, and it resulted in people like myself getting bored. They released a mini expansion which they called an adventure by the name of Naxxramas, but it only added 30 new cards, and it was drip-fed over the course of 5 weeks. And while it was a very interesting way of delivering the content and the single-player stuff was very enjoyable, it just wasn't enough to keep the game fresh. And since the game was in open beta for a significant amount of time, we were looking at the course of a year with no significant content updates to the game whatsoever. And then along came Goblins vs. Gnomes, and not a moment too soon, adding in a huge number of new cards and throwing in a bunch of interesting new mechanics and card types, which I very much enjoyed. It really threw everything back up in the air and said, metagame, what metagame? Some may perhaps rightly argue that the expansion introduced a few too many random elements to the game, but it has resulted in some very interesting situations indeed, and it has very much got me back into the game in a big way alongside many others, because frankly, we were all bored. Diablo 3, Reaper of Souls. I'll be the first person to say that I didn't like Diablo 3 whatsoever on launch. I felt that the always-on DRM was going to be a disaster, and as it turns out, it very much was, especially on its initial release, Era 37 being a trending topic on Twitter, for God's sake, it was that bad. And frankly, the game was somewhat disappointing. The default difficulty that you were forced to play through on when the game first came out was extremely simple, and you had to play through several times in order to get to the point where the loot would actually mean anything, and where the difficulty was actually significant. And more to the point, once you reached that Inferno difficulty, it was full of cheese. Horribly unbalanced cheese. The addition of the real money auction house didn't help things at all, and loot was just flat out dull. It was looking like the first botched game for Blizzard. And then along came Reaper of Souls, which fixed so many problems. It completely revamped the difficulty system, which made the game much more enjoyable from the very outset. It made the loot more meaningful. It added in a ton of interesting stuff. It got rid of the real money auction house. It added in huge amounts of additional endgame content and continued to develop that to this day. It is a much, much better game for it. It was a hell of a lot more enjoyable as a result, and I played through the whole thing with Reaper of Souls and had a whale of a time, frankly. This expansion successfully saved what would otherwise have been the worst game in Blizzard's history. It also seemed to mark a fundamental change in attitude from the company that previously had been in a position where they could do no wrong, and yet Reaper of Souls marked a renewed interest in listening to the game's player base and acting sincerely upon their feedback, and that's trickled down to a bunch of other games in their library as well, and as a direct result, well, Blizzard is looking stronger than ever. BioShock: Burial at Sea. I've been reasonably outspoken in my dislike for BioShock Infinite. While it was an incredible accomplishment in terms of visuals and storytelling, I found that the game was mechanically rather weak. And in comparison to BioShock 2, which many people for some reason didn't really like, I found that it was several steps backwards. It also took a great deal of time for the promised DLC content to be released. The first piece, Clash in the Clouds, was little more than a wave-based shooter and frankly a waste of time. Along came Burial at Sea Part 1, and suddenly I thought, hang on a minute, this seems to be getting back on the rails. It was a stronger, if more focused and narrower experience than BioShock Infinite, and then along comes Burial at Sea Episode 2, which really knocks it out of the park. The best thing that Burial at Sea Part 2 realizes is that the gunplay of BioShock has traditionally been a fairly weak point of the series. It's not that good a first-person shooter. So what does Burial at Sea Part 2 do? It shifts its focus to stealth-based gameplay and plasmid use instead. So you've got less of the big gunfights, you've got more of the sneaking around and the use of the stuff that's genuinely interesting. It's also nice to have a big shift in protagonist as well, and as a result, Burial at Sea Part 2 is really, really satisfying, and frankly, the Burial at Sea expansion is, in my opinion, a better game than Infinite was. It's really very impressive, and it took them a while, but they put together something that was very satisfying and frankly could be played on its own and would stand up to scrutiny without any help from BioShock Infinite. Shadowrun Dragonfall. This expansion to Shadowrun Returns feels like a massive improvement over Shadowrun Returns, and I liked Shadowrun Returns, but it had its problems. It felt fairly linear. You didn't really get to stay in one area for too long and explore. Backtracking wasn't really a possibility. Well, with Shadowrun Dragonfall, they based the expansion around a hub town, which allows you to slowly build up your gang and earn more cash and upgrades. And the whole thing leads to a much more cohesive experience. It doesn't feel like you're being shoved down a linear story path. You get to take things on at your own pace, explore some really interesting and well-written side quests, and meet some really cool characters. This is the classic CRPG experience that I think a lot of people were looking for when they got Shadowrun Returns, and maybe they got some of it out of the original, but they were maybe left a little bit disappointed. Dragonfall on its own is absolutely worth playing, and it's worth noting that it is standalone, so you don't even have to play the original. In addition to this, they added some new missions with the Director's Cut, which is a free update, and revamped the combat system and the UI, which provided improved feedback for those that were having a few issues with the cover system and user interface within the isometric combat system. It's really, really good. If you are into the classic cyberpunk, then you should be looking at Dragonfall without question. And if perhaps you're a little bit disappointed with Shadowrun Returns, well, give Dragonfall a shot. I have a feeling that you might change your mind. Dark Souls 2: The Crown Trilogy. The Souls games are not exactly known for their DLC, at least up until Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls Prepare to Die Edition on PC received some additional content, but it wasn't until Dark Souls 2 that the developers from Software decided to make some really serious DLC, and what they did was they created a trilogy of DLC named The Crowns: The Crown of the Ivory King, Sunken King, and Old Iron King. These levels are very well designed, very expansive, and very challenging. They add some fantastic boss content into the game, and each of them are significant improvements on the areas that you already found within Dark Souls 2. These DLC capitalize on what's best about the Souls series: non-linear exploration, challenging and intriguing level design, packed with interesting areas to find, and very difficult boss encounters to discover. Each of the 3 DLC also offers some very nice and varied areas, and a good amount of content considering the price tag. The Crown Trilogy essentially gives the Dark Souls 2 fans exactly what they had been asking for in terms of additional content. It is a classic example of well-done DLC. 2014 was a very strange year for expansion and DLC content. It was a year where season passes were bought and found to be disappointing. It was a year where season passes were cancelled. It was a year in which games that had been out for a mere 2 months were willing to put out content that cost $20 a piece. For all the potential that DLC has, more often than not, we see it squandered on pieces of content that are, frankly, far too sparse for the cost of asking. And more often than not, we find that when we do want DLC expansion content for a title that left us begging for more, we don't end up getting it in the first place. We're asked to pre-order season passes with no knowledge of what will be contained within, and more often than not, a microtransaction is anything but. Regardless of all of that, there are still great pieces of DLC, and these are games that would certainly be lessened if this expansion content was not released. Our nominees are some of the finest examples of expansion content this year, but the game that is going to clinch it will be Hearthstone's Goblins vs. Gnomes. This is something you probably saw coming. Definitely not the best value of expansion content, in fact, quite the opposite. I grew up playing collectible card games, Magic the Gathering, and all sorts of things like that, so I am somewhat used to that business model. Some people find it absolutely abhorrent. Personally, I have really no problem with it. The fact of the matter is that Hearthstone really desperately needed a big expansion. It really needed to refresh things. It was far behind when compared to other collectible card games that released expansion content at a much more regular rate. The meta was becoming stale, players were becoming bored, and it looked like the success of Hearthstone would be squandered due to a lack of updates. And then along comes Goblins vs. Gnomes, which reminds me exactly why I liked the game in the first place. In fact, this game has spent more playtime on my machine in the past month than anything else put together. It is that damn enjoyable. It continues to be extremely fun, challenging, and, at least for the time being, it's a wonderful new world of variety and wackiness, and I very much appreciate that. I arbitrarily declare that Hearthstone Goblins vs. Gnomes is the best piece of expansion content in 2014. Best Mobile Game. The nominees for Best Mobile Game are Monument Valley. If we were judging this category merely by visuals, I would imagine that Monument Valley would be a runaway winner. It is absolutely gorgeous. It's the sort of game where you could take a screenshot and then hang it on your wall. It looks that damn good. As to what the game is, well, it's a puzzle game involving navigating seemingly impossible kind of MC Escher-esque environments. It involves rotating various areas of the level in order to get to the next part, and it uses a very elegant touch-based design. Prior to the release of its expansion, I would have perhaps said, well, 1, the game's a little bit too easy, and 2, it's a little bit too short. However, the expansion does, to some degree, address both of those concerns, and Monument Valley's commercial success is heartening in a world full of absolute, creatively bankrupt tosh to be found on mobile devices. Castle Doombad. Tower defense games are 2 a penny. On mobile devices, they are one of the most popular genres. They are one of the easiest genres to develop. Castle Doombad comes along and says, we're just really, really good at it. We're going to mix in a little bit of tower defense, we're going to mix in a little bit of dungeon keeper, and you are going to get to play the bad guy. And they pulled it off. It's got this wonderful Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic to it, it's deliciously entertaining to play the bad guy, and it has a number of interesting mechanics and, thankfully, a lack of reliance on pay-to-win ideas. Castle Doombad was without a doubt my favorite TD in 2014. The question is it the best mobile game? 80 Days. When I was growing up, I used to read a lot of choose-your-own-adventure books, and the next step up from that was the Fighting Fantasy series by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, which integrated actual RPG mechanics into the choose-your-own-adventure story. As it turned out, the Fighting Fantasy books would find a new lease of life on iOS platforms with a sudden surge in popularity of choose-your-own-adventure-style visual novels. Well, along comes 80 Days and blows all of them out of the water with incredible visuals and this fantastic story, an adaptation of Jules Verne's novel Around the World in 80 Days, set in an alternate history. You are given the task of helping your master find different routes around the world, managing resources, and discovering new and interesting items to assist you in your cause. It's absolutely wonderful. Hitman Go. There's a lot to be said for minimalistic game mechanics and breaking down a game into its absolute base elements. It's the sort of thing that board games do a great deal, and they rely perhaps purely on theme and very simple but robust mechanics in order to create an enjoyable experience. Instead of attempting to port Hitman to an iOS device and having to sacrifice so much of what made the Hitman games good, they decided instead boil down the Hitman experience to its most basic level and rebuild it from there. What is Hitman about? It's about hits, as you might imagine. and you are given what is essentially a puzzle game. It reminds me so much of a board game interpretation of an otherwise more complicated game and set of game mechanics. It lives and thrives on theme. It has an incredible presentation style, and it's just a really enjoyable puzzle game that keeps the essence of what makes a Hitman game Hitman without being anything like the Hitman games on PC. It is one hell of a spin-off. Threes. Well, this could be in a category of its own for worst injustice in the world. Threes is not that well known in comparison to 2048, the game that basically ripped it off, was released for free and then cloned a million times. Threes was a labor of love. It's not only mechanically divine, subtle, and incredibly well put together, but it's visually gorgeous. A lot of work was put into creating a puzzle game with real personality. If you play enough of Threes, you will believe that certain numbers like certain things, that they have their own hobbies and lifestyles. That's what Threes conveys. It's a very enjoyable and rewarding puzzle game. Unfortunately, it didn't do that well because the clone, the much more simplified clone, 2048, came along, it was free, and it was much, much easier to play. And it was completely devoid of any of the wonderful personality and hard work that went into Threes. It's frankly tragic to see that regardless of its critical reception, Threes was crushed by an inferior clone. It's a story we hear all too often on mobile devices. Mobile devices are often looked down upon. The marketplaces are flooded with clones after clones after clones, just unoriginal titles designed to milk as much cash out of you as humanly possible. They are the kings of pointless free-to-play grindfests. They are the kings of intellectual property infringement. And we hear so many tales of innovative titles doing incredibly badly in a marketplace where creating the same game over and over again will reward you with millions of dollars. Thankfully, though, every now and again we do see some absolutely incredible titles that really take advantage of what mobile devices have to offer. They don't attempt to emulate the software of other platforms, they don't attempt to emulate the control schemes, they take advantage of their unique attributes, and every game on this list does just that. The game which blew me away the most, though, on mobile devices comes from Inkle Studios, and it is the one and only 80 Days. This is the studio that seems to have mastered the idea of telling a story in pseudo-book form on a touch screen. They did it with Sorcery, which was an adaptation of a Steve Jackson fighting fantasy series, and they do it again with 80 Days, their own original story based, of course, on the famous work of Jules Verne. And it's the presentation that blows my mind on this. This is absolutely gorgeous. It is artistically wonderful, but it's the way that the game presents its information that truly boggles my mind. It feels like it's a book being read to you, and yet you are a part of the story. You don't feel like you're watching it, you feel like you're truly immersed in it. Just tiny little details, even things as subtle as the way that the text is brought onto the screen. It really does make you feel like you're having a story read to you. The wonderful art style, and of course the fact that they have integrated some real, genuine gameplay and choices in there. There are many ways to complete this game, and it has a reasonable amount of replayability, which is the sort of thing you don't necessarily find in a choose-your-own-adventure story. They've taken a simple concept and they have enhanced it to the point where this is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best choose-your-own-adventure concepts I've ever seen executed on anything. I hope they adapt more books in this way. I really hope that they get to do some more stuff with Steve Jackson material, because these guys know exactly what they're doing. Do yourself a favor, curl yourself up in a big armchair, get yourself a copy of 80 Days, and enjoy. The game I turned my consoles on for the most this year. The nominations for the game I turned my console on for the most this year are as follows. Bayonetta 2. Platinum games are usually a pretty damn safe bet when it comes to spectacle fighters or the character action genre, but in 2010 they released a game called Bayonetta, which blew everything else out of the water and still, as far as I'm concerned, remains the best spectacle fighter ever made by anybody. It was my top game of 2010, and while it sold relatively well, there were no signs of a sequel despite universal critical acclaim. So imagine my surprise when it was announced that Bayonetta 2 was coming along, published by Nintendo, and exclusive to the Wii U. A very puzzling thing indeed. I certainly scratched my head a little, and I was disappointed that as a result of the publisher decision, they wouldn't be releasing it on any other platforms, but ultimately Nintendo is the one that financed this game, and it resulted in Bayonetta 2 actually being released. That is a very good thing, because Bayonetta 2 is easily the best spectacle fighter of this year by a country mile. It is an iterative sequel, but a logically iterative sequel, because yes, actually I did want more of the same Bayonetta action, with a few bells and whistles added on for good measure. I wanted more of that character, I wanted more of that fighting system, I wanted more of that world, and I wanted more of these ridiculously over-designed bosses and enemies, and you've got that in spades, and yet more besides, thanks to the denizens of hell itself. Bayonetta 2 is an absolutely superb game, and actually cemented in my mind the Wii U as the best console for core gamers in 2014. Which is, again, a little bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? Guilty Gear Xrd. This is certainly a late bloomer to the list, but it deserves its spot nonetheless. A superb fighting game from Arc System Works, absolutely phenomenal in terms of its aesthetic. It just narrowly missed the shortlist for that earlier, but it finds itself here on my list because, good lord, what a great fighting game. Not only does it look incredible with an excellent use of 3D in an otherwise 2D fighting game, but it also has a superb tutorial, amazing soundtrack as Guilty Gear is certainly known for, a wealth of modes, and a really solid fighting system. In a year that has lacked a lot of mainstream fighting games with the exception of Smash Bros., we've had some slightly more niche titles from Japan, and a lot of them have been very good. The one, as far as I'm concerned, that holds the crown has got to be Guilty Gear Xrd. It is a great reason to turn on my PS4. Fibbage. I remember playing a game by the name of You Don't Know Jack a very, very long time ago, and the company inexplicably survived the massive financial crash and recession and came out with Fibbage, which is a nice and simple but very enjoyable game about lying. Now, not only is it a very enjoyable party game that you can get all of your friends around regardless of gaming experience and have a great time, but it also happens to be innovative in terms of the technology it uses, because it integrates with smartphones and tablets. This gets around the problem of controllers, it also gets around the problem of having to hide your answers, and indeed it's perhaps the next evolution of this asymmetric multiplayer game design where having your own screen unlocks a wealth of new mechanical possibilities. Fibbage is hilarious, there's no doubt about that. It is now actually available on PC, so I can just play it there, but until that happened, Fibbage was an absolute blast to play with friends and guests, and many, many laughs were had as a direct result of it. Diablo 3: Reaper of Souls Ultimate Evil Edition. This is an odd choice, you might say. Don't you already have Diablo 3: Reaper of Souls on PC? I do. And in many ways, the game on PC is superior because, hey, technology, right? But Reaper of Souls Ultimate Evil Edition on PlayStation 4 has one thing going for it that the version on PC does not have, and that is couch co-op. And you would be surprised with the tweaks to the gameplay and perspective, as well as things like drop rates and the size of enemy packs, just how enjoyable couch co-op can actually be with Diablo 3. In fact, with the change of perspective and the addition of the dodge roll, it almost reminds me of playing games like Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, which were absolute blasts. Great interpretations of what would otherwise be a CRPG translated to an action RPG hack-and-slash format. It's a really good example of a game that shouldn't necessarily work on console being ported very, very well, and the proper adaptations being made to the format, which I universally approve of, even though I'm a PC gamer. I want to see that on all platforms, and Blizzard delivered with Reaper of Souls Ultimate Evil Edition. Honestly, the only problem that I have with it is the frequent frame drops. Otherwise, if you can get a few people around with some controllers, playing Diablo 3 on PlayStation 4 is actually a much different experience indeed to playing it on PC. Mario Kart 8. It's pretty damn hard to argue against the simple pleasures of Mario Kart, and it's yet another game in Nintendo's commitment to producing fun, enjoyable games that feel good and run at 60 frames per second. Despite the relative weakness of the hardware of the Wii U, Mario Kart 8 looks gorgeous. Nintendo are very good at picking their aesthetics, picking their art styles, and making the most of their hardware. Mario Kart 8 is absolutely no exception to that, and it looks and feels great. The only problem I've got with it is that I'm constantly getting destroyed by my 11-year-old son. I'm okay with this because I'm pretty sure I can still beat him at StarCraft, at least for the time being. Mario Kart 8 is packed with content. The multiplayer, especially of course on the couch, is absolutely phenomenal. It is a colorful, enjoyable, and thoroughly gorgeous romp. And just the latest example of Nintendo's successful iteration on a very successful franchise. I'm gonna be entirely honest, this year has been absolutely terrible for console releases, especially as a PC gamer. And you might be saying to me, well, why do you care? Well, I care because I own the consoles. I like to own all the platforms so I can experience the best games. But even when it comes to exclusives, consoles have been throwing out games that run at 30 frames per second or lower that, as far as I'm concerned, are pretty much unplayable to anyone that is an experienced gamer that is used to 60 frames per second or higher. As a result, I have bought the least number of console games this year compared to any other year in recent memory. It's not been a good thing at all, and it's not looking to really get any better as publishers and developers fixate on this idea of maximum graphical fidelity at the expense of gameplay, which is a thoroughly abhorrent thing to do as far as I'm concerned. Thankfully, it's not all of them, and there are a few games that definitely get me sitting down on the couch and willing to play on console once again, and I really don't care what platform I play on as long as I get the experience that I want. It's just unfortunate that many consoles at the moment are simply not giving me that. So, with all of that talk of frame rate in mind, I announced that Fibbage is the game that I turned my console on for the most this year. It is. It just is. That's the reality of it, and it's the game that I had the most fun with out of all of those. Yes, including Bayonetta 2. Fibbage is hilarious. It is. It's fantastic. Yes, you need friends or online acquaintances to play it with. But it's a great example of a very simple concept well executed, and using technology that most people have at their disposal in a really innovative way. And it's not the only game that these guys created this year that did that. Drawful just came out, as well as things like Lieswatter. These are games that utilize smartphones and tablets to interface with the console or the PC in order to create a really cool multiplayer experience where everyone has their own screen. I expect more of that in 2015. It's a really clever idea, and frankly, party games like Fibbage take the best of tabletop and board gaming, put it onto a console or PC, and use technology to make the experience really enjoyable. So there you go, folks. That is not a lie. It is Fibbage. The game that most surpassed my expectations. The nominations for the game that most surpassed my expectations are Shovel Knight. Look, in my line of work, I play a lot of indie platformers. It is the most predominant genre of stuff I get sent on a daily basis. I have hundreds of them. Literally hundreds. Now, this maybe wouldn't be so bad if I actually liked platformers in the first place, but I don't. So, platformers get a pretty tough time on this channel, and I like to think at least I'm reasonably fair, despite the fact that I don't really like the genre. Along comes Shovel Knight with a great degree of hype behind it, and I'm initially somewhat dismissive because I think, oh god, it's another retro platformer, we've heard all of these promises before. And then I played the damn thing and realized, you know what, good game design really is timeless. It doesn't matter where it comes from in the chronology of gaming history. This is a damn good game. It is incredibly responsive. The levels are ridiculously diverse. The boss fights are awesome. Each level is packed with variety, not only in terms of theme, but also in terms of mechanics. They have little gimmicks going on that keep the action fresh, and while it is really about jumping over pits and killing things with a shovel, you'd be surprised at how many ways you can actually end up doing that by the end of it. Shovel Knight is great, and I didn't expect it to be. One Finger Death Punch. Here's what you've got to understand. Silver Dollar Games has released a huge amount of absolute tat on Xbox Live Indie. Just awful. We're talking about things like Who's the Daddy? Murder on Snake Road, Cootie's Patient Zero. They even have a game called Try Not to Fart. This stuff is absolute junk. Then they made One Finger Death Punch. And honestly, the expectations about as low as you could possibly get after looking at who the developer was. But what a game! Oh my god! What a responsive and incredibly simple but ridiculously satisfying game. It doesn't look good, but it doesn't have to look good. It's hideous. It could have been drawn by a 5-year-old. But it doesn't matter because it doesn't play like it was made by a 5-year-old. It's one of those games that represents the fast-paced kinetic nature of Kung Fu in an incredibly rudimentary but ridiculously effective way. It's a game that really only uses 2 buttons and yet is both challenging and varied. How do you do that? You've got to play One Finger Death Punch to actually understand how they did that. It's a blast. It is unbelievable. It's simplicity incarnate in a phenomenal package of moment-to-moment enjoyment. That is what One Finger Death Punch is. And I expected Try Not to Fart too. Ziggurat. One of the other genres that I get a great deal of are roguelikes. Well, they call themselves roguelikes. I like the term roguelite, because a roguelike game is a very specific genre, and the genre has been widened by people that, frankly, shouldn't be talking, and I don't agree with that. I'm afraid I don't. Sorry, I'm an Angband player. That's what I played when I was much younger. Umoria, Angband, Zangband, Sangband, a lot of other bands, but there were quite a lot of variants in that game. It's a very specific kind of genre, but the ideas of roguelike have been translated into various other genres, and one of those is the first-person shooter. And up to this point, there haven't been really any games that have thoroughly succeeded in doing so. There have been ones that have come close, there have been ones that have fallen flat on their face, but it's a difficult transition because you're looking at a game that is probably going to be procedurally generated. It's very hard to create a procedurally generated FPS that actually feels like a first-person shooter. The first-person component feels like an afterthought, very much so. Ziggurat not only creates really enjoyable levels, but the first-person shooting component is not an afterthought. The first thing it does is give you a second weapon right off the bat, which is genius, because so many of these other FPS roguelites have stuck you with one weapon for a long time, which means the combat isn't varied, it's boring, it's repetitive. And the cool thing about it is every time you go through the game, you're probably going to unlock a new weapon, and you get a random chance of getting that the next time around, and each playthrough ends up feeling different. Now, of course, it helps that each weapon has an alternate fire mode, it helps that the game feels like a souped-up version of Hexen and Heretic, and it helps that it's fast-paced, precise, and a hell of a lot of magical fun. That's what Ziggurat is, and I didn't expect it to be as engaging as it was, because it's not a genre that I generally enjoy. And Ziggurat came and said, no, we can do this right. And this is what it feels like. Wolfenstein: The New Order. I think I had a justifiable reason for not expecting much of Wolfenstein, because the first time that I played it was on an Xbox 360 at PAX, and I played the first level. Or at least bits of the first level. The most boring bits of the first level. And I thought to myself, oh god, what have you done to my beloved Wolfenstein? I'm even an advocate of Wolfenstein 2009, and not many people like that game. What have you done? We're on rails again. It's slow, it's clunky, there's Call of Duty nonsense. I can't progress, I can't walk forward because someone has to open a bloody door for me. What have you done? And it could not have been further from the truth. That was the worst demonstration that I have ever played at an expo, because it completely misrepresented what the final product was, which, as it turns out, was Wolfenstein through and through. It was a classic shooter with new tricks. It was a bombastic romp. It was just joyous, bullet-fueled mayhem. And yet somehow, underneath all of that, underneath the dual-wielded assault rifles, underneath Nazi death robots, underneath Nazis on the moon, we actually have a good story, well-fleshed-out characters, excellent writing and voice acting. And that's not supposed to happen. And it did. And Machine Games are responsible for that. Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor.
What is this place?
Licensed games. Oh me, oh my. This one arrived with relatively little fanfare. early footage that we saw made the game look like a cross between Assassin's Creed and Batman. It looked like the game wasn't really presenting anything new to the genre, and frankly, it looked like it was just riding on the coattails of the Hobbit movies and just saying, oh, let's get another game out of Middle-earth somehow. Well, it was maybe the best game that's come out of Middle-earth, and frankly, Middle-earth has had quite a few good games to its name, but along comes Shadow of Mordor and says, not only can I do open-world Batman with a little bit of Assassin's Creed thrown in there for good measure, but I can do actual assassination better than Assassin's Creed, thanks to the Nemesis system, which is absolutely wonderful. This is a game about creating your own stories, grudges, and rivalries. This is a game where everybody is going to have their own unique tale to tell. They're going to have those moments that nobody else experienced because the way that the Nemesis system works is that it creates rivals and enemies for you. And you hold a grudge against these guys. Someone kills you and ranks up and gains new armor and gloats at you. You want that guy in the ground, and you will pursue that goal. And it feels very organic. It's not a set of side objectives that are given to you at certain times during the game arbitrarily. No, it's an honest-to-God rivalry that a system created for you based on your own failure. And what genius is that? The ability to create really cool gameplay moments thanks to your failures, not your successes. Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor is anything but a failure. And despite Warner Brothers' best efforts to torpedo the game by getting themselves into a PR disaster involving only giving review copies to YouTubers that were willing to sign into a paid influencer agreement, this game is phenomenal and received universal acclaim for damn good reasons. So, next time, Warner Brothers and the PR agencies that they hire, stay the hell out of it. Let the game speak for itself. Some people have claimed that this year has been somewhat disappointing for games, and I can kind of see why, but the cool thing about it is that it wasn't the AAAs that were coming along to surprise and dazzle us this year, it was the stuff that was coming in under the radar, and yes, that includes AAA quality titles, and yes, that includes really cool indies. One of the nice things about the WTF is format, the first impressions, is that I'm able to really express my joy for a particular title that's really impressed me while demonstrating it on screen and engaging in the very thing that's giving me joy in the first place. It fuels my enthusiasm and my passion for this industry. It's even cooler to be able to discover a game that pops up out of nowhere and be able to showcase it on the channel and really give it a shot, give it the spotlight that it deserves. It is a very fulfilling part of my career. And I'd like to thank all of you guys for letting me do that. It really means a lot to me. Now, which game? It's so close, incredibly close. Any of these games could have very easily got it, but I'm going to award it to Wolfenstein: The New Order. Because it is the best FPS of 2014, by a country mile. No, it's not even close. It's incredibly good. First-person shooters, by and large, have been stuck in a horrible rut the last few years, and I have made my opinion on that very well known. I am extremely salty on that particular subject. But Wolfenstein: The New Order comes in, and it's greeted at the door by an usher. The usher says, "Welcome, sir. Here is the pamphlet." The pamphlet is delicately handed to Wolfenstein: The New Order by the usher wearing his signature white glove. Inside the pamphlet is a set of rules and guidelines which must be adhered to if you wish to release a successful first-person shooter in 2014. You must have multiplayer. You must design for the console first. You must fill the game with walking sections. You must have AI compadres that open doors for you because Lord knows you're incapable of doing such things yourself. And make sure you don't have a campaign that's any longer than 4 hours because, kids' attention spans these days. Wolfenstein takes one look at the pamphlet, throws it in the usher's face and says, "I own this town, this is my show now." And it gives a bombastic and wonderfully indulgent first-person shooting experience. It's awesome. You should play it. Please play it. Wolfenstein: The New Order is without a doubt the game that most surpassed my expectations in 2014. The Sharpened Pitchfork Award for Dodgiest Games Company of the Year. Oh, I've been looking forward to this one. The nominations for the Sharpened Pitchfork Award are as follows. Electronic Arts. Surprisingly, these guys barely made the list this year. If this was last year, they'd have probably run away with this particular award. This is the company that's been named Worst Company in America 2 years running. despite the fact that there are companies that caused the financial collapse. I mean, geez, people really do not like EA, but surprisingly enough, EA's biggest crime this year was probably just mere mediocrity. That said, they do deserve absolutely justifiable derision for what they did to one of my favorite franchises, Dungeon Keeper. Dungeon Keeper Mobile is abhorrent. It represents everything that's wrong with both the free-to-play business model and mobile development in general. It takes the legacy of a classic, critically acclaimed series and wipes its ass with it. It is absolutely disgusting. Outside of that, EA has managed to stay relatively out of the controversy spotlight, but it did that via mediocrity. It released the beta for Battlefield Hardline, and people almost universally replied by saying, "This is Battlefield 4 with police cars." Thankfully, they then decided to delay it till 2015 rather than shoving it out the door in November, and everybody is thankful for that. They released Sims 4, which was, in many ways, a huge step backwards from Sims 3. They shoved Plants vs. Zombies Garden Warfare out the door with relatively little fanfare, which sucks because it's probably the best game they released this year. And then, of course, they drowned us in typically buggy sports titles. The sad thing is, after all that, that's probably one of the best years that EA has had. Double Fine. God, it hurts to put this company on the list, but their performance in 2014 has certainly warranted it. In fact, it warrants it merely for making me agree with Bobby Kotick, of all people. Years ago, we sided, of course, with Tim Schafer when Bobby Kotick made remarks that this was a guy that was frequently missing every deadline and unable to manage a project. Well, as it turns out, in 2014, it seems that Double Fine bit off far more than they could chew. And what did it result in? Consumers getting burned. Double Fine was a company that was considered to be perhaps one of the biggest indie darlings, and a lot of trust was put in them by the consumer. They ran 2 highly successful Kickstarters, and yet one of them ballooned to the point where they ran out of money, despite raising several times the amount that they initially asked for. It seems that feature creep had really taken hold of Broken Age and resulted in the game being broken up into 2 parts. What appears as less than half of the game arrives over a year late, and despite its release at the start of 2014, the final episode, the second half of the game, is still nowhere to be seen. It's not lacking the Double Fine quality that we expect, but this is yet another example of mismanagement from the company, and that's not the worst thing that they did this year. Double Fine over the last couple of years has really got into the idea of selling you things before they're ready, and Space-Based DF9 promised a Dwarf Fortress-like experience in space and was released on early access with, frankly, very little content. Now that sounds fine until you realize that development was suddenly halted with a huge list of promised features and ideas being deleted from the website and an apology being given that says, look, we just don't have the funding to develop this game anymore. This resulted in those that backed the game receiving an incomplete experience that was dumped upon them with the promise that they, themselves as the players, could perhaps finish it with mods. No, this is not how you release games at all, and as far as I'm concerned, Double Fine has succeeded in shaking the confidence of consumers in both Kickstarter and the Early Access program this year, and despite several other successful releases such as Costume Quest 2 and Hack and Slash, this is a company that really needs someone with a better business mind to right the ship and tighten things up. Strategy first. Of all of the companies that have managed to suddenly exacerbate the open doors policy of Steam, Strategy First has got to be one of the worst. They have dumped huge amounts of terrible video games on Steam over the last year. Abominations such as Bad Rats are the responsibility of this publisher. Games like Desert Gunner, games like Clans, a game that doesn't even have working music unless you burn an audio CD. Over half of its Steam catalog has either mixed or negative reviews. It has no concern for quality control. It doesn't ensure that its games actually run on modern platforms despite being willing to take money for them. And it has buried so many good titles on the front page with its 6 to 7 game dump releases of absolute tat. It's probably one of the reasons why Steam was redesigned in the first place, to deal with all of this nonsense. They have published some good titles, but they are few and far between, I assure you of that. Ubisoft. This is the other big evil. This is the yin to EA's yang. This is the big dog, the huge publisher, and the guys that have absolutely managed to surpass Electronic Arts this year in terms of sheer villainy and incompetence. Ubisoft did not have a good year at all. This is a company that massively overpromised and hugely underdelivered in 2014 in almost every respect. Assassin's Creed Unity is only one game that they put out this year that was a disappointment. Watch Dogs, one of the most hyped games of all time, ended up being, frankly, fairly middle of the road, competent, even good in some areas, but massively disappointing. Open world third-person shooter. This is a game that was supposed to change the face of AAA gaming as we knew it. Did it? Hell no, it didn't. Despite its repeated claims that the game had not been downgraded, once the final product reached our hands, it was blindingly obvious that the E3 footage was not in any way representative of the final quality of the product. A dodgy PC port and problems with Uplayer plenty certainly put the nail in that coffin. And then, of course, we have Far Cry 4, which strangely was perhaps one of the least disappointing big releases from these guys this year, because it's the same as Far Cry 3. My God, the lack of innovation in that game is absolutely staggering, and it's good perhaps simply due to its heritage. And even then, they couldn't manage to get the PC port working properly for that one. I mean, how do you even manage that? You just upgraded an older engine. You've had like 2 years to fix it, and yet they managed to not do that regardless. That game was dodgy on launch on almost every PC as well. Needless to say, at the end of the year, we had The Crew, which wasn't so much of a disaster as it was a game that could have been absolutely incredible, something that could have changed the face of, hang on a minute, we've heard this before, haven't we? That's the second game that Ubisoft has released with bloody cars this year that has ended up promising the earth and delivering an otherwise reasonably competent but thoroughly uninspired experience. And wow, have they laden games with microtransactions this year. That seems to be the modus operandi of Ubisoft. Let's shove as many microtransactions into games that absolutely should not have them as humanly possible. But yes, we will charge you $60 up front for the bloody privilege of accessing that store, and that's assuming that the store even works if Uplay happens to be up that day through some arcane sorcery. Ugh. You know what bothers me the most? It's not even all of that. It's the fact that they actually released 2 games this year which have been completely overshadowed by their boundless incompetence, Valiant Hearts, and Child of Light. These games deserved far more attention, but at the end of the day, people aren't going to remember them, are they? No, they're going to remember the sheer incompetence, the boundless silliness and mistakes that Ubisoft have made at the expense of the consumer in 2014. This year will be remembered, if anything, as the year of unfinished products. It will be remembered, I hope, as the year where people woke the hell up to the fact that companies are entirely fine with releasing unfinished games and charging you premium for them. It will hopefully be a time when consumers realize that pre-ordering is bad for them as consumers. It's not just bad for the industry, it's personally bad for them. It's a pointless gamble they don't need to take. The odds are in favor of the house here, not in favor of the gamer. It's been a year of releasing the same games as HD remakes and remasters. It's been a year where consoles have had very little inspiring put on them whatsoever. But I think it should be obvious by my rhetoric that the one company that went beyond all others to mess things up this year has got to be Ubisoft. What a disastrous year for them, their franchises, and the people that enjoy their games. It's not like Ubisoft releases consistently bad games either. This has been just a botched year for them, and I really hope it's a wake-up call that they can't take on so many products simultaneously. They can't just throw money at a problem and hope it solves itself, and they can't keep releasing unfinished broken tat for $60 bloody. Their act of contrition at the end of the year, cancelling the season pass and giving free games and content to those that were burned by their purchase of Assassin's Creed Unity, is, I hope, a step in the right direction to a brighter future for Ubisoft in 2015, because they release games that I enjoy playing. But please explain your obsession with radio towers. Good lord, can you stop? I mean, does your lead designer have a fetish or what? The game that most needs to see the light of Gabe Newell. Our nominations for the Light of GabeN Award are as follows: Sunset Overdrive, What do we have here? Well, we have an Xbox One exclusive, a wonderful, colorful, third-person shooter that's all about wacky weapons and enemies and silliness. It's about rail grinding and sliding down things and jumping over other things and bouncing on trampolines and doing all sorts of weird, wonderful, and fun things. High-paced, high-action shooter gameplay at a glorious cinematic 30 frames per second. The Xbox One isn't powerful enough, apparently, to run the game at a proper frame rate, and that is why it needs to be on PC, where we don't have that problem. Who knows, maybe with Microsoft's supposed renewed effort to deal with PC gaming with Windows 10, we might actually see some of these games make their way over, although some of them have fled the platform already. We've got Rise and Dead Rising 3. Didn't actually ask for any of them, but hey, it's a start, right? Destiny. So, Bungie, is it? Well, I see here that you made a loot-focused, massively multiplayer, first-person shooter. Okay, that sounds pretty good. I also see that you didn't release it on the one platform that not only has several successful games of that type already, but has a keyboard and mouse, the optimal control method for such a thing. Not only that, but in the genre that even console developers admit is perhaps most affected by frame rate, you chose to release it at 30 frames per second. And the reason that you gave was due to it being a cross-generational game. Now, just a little hint here, but not only do PC users really like first-person shooters, but they also really like MMO first-person shooters and loot. In fact, they're very much into that, as it turns out. And you know what? We don't have generations to worry about either. We don't have to hold back our games because some 9-year-old console is getting a little bit arthritic over there. No. But I suppose the delay is something of a blessing, considering how content-light Destiny appears to be and considering the numerous problems that it still has. It's probably best that PC gamers wait for a possible PC port, and if it does end up arriving, then the hope is that it will have much more content by that point. So I suppose we can then turn around and ask the console users for beta testing.
Everything humans have.
Halo, the Master Chief Collection. Well, we got Halo 1 and 2. They weren't very good, because the ports were kind of rubbish, but hey, we actually still play Halo to this very day. You can even do it online, something which you can't do on the Xbox, because of course the service doesn't exist anymore. You know, the sad thing was that Halo Combat Evolved was initially intended to be on PC in the first place. That was going to be its platform, and then it was scooped up by Microsoft. And since then, we've had a bunch of, frankly, really good shooters released on a platform that doesn't really do well with shooters, because hey, who wants to use a controller over a keyboard and mouse? I mean, you shouldn't be surprised to be hearing this opinion coming from me. This is a PC channel. My bias is clear and worn on my sleeve. This collection of remasters would be ideal for the PC. It's a great opportunity to finally release the whole thing on PC and make up for lost time. And yet, we see hide nor hair of that. I wonder if that is perhaps due to Microsoft desperately wanting a reason to pick up an Xbox One, considering the distinct lack of them it's had the entire year. Hell, you wouldn't even have to put in that much effort. You've already got the games running at 60 FPS on inferior hardware, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem to get that going on PC. Think about it for a second. Wonderful multiplayer community, mod support, higher res textures, customizable field of view. Oh, I'm salivating just thinking about it. Hopefully we eventually get it. Drive Club. Man, I look at the weather physics in that game, and I think to myself, God, my PC would chew them up. That would be so wonderful. How great it would be to unleash a racing game from its inexplicable 30 frames per second shackles. How awesome it would be to be able to render those physics effects in even higher detail. How great it would be perhaps to integrate it with Steamworks, a platform whose online connectivity matchmaking and connectivity features don't fall over every 5 minutes like PlayStation Network has with Drive Club since its bloody release. How great all of those things would be. Oh, I mean, honestly, I feel sorry for the developers. It's gonna be like a filmmaker creating a visual masterwork and then having people watch it on their bloody phones. PC has had a pretty damn good year, frankly. We've had some bad ports. Ubisoft has been responsible for many of them. But that's the wonderful nature of PC. We still get a better experience than console, regardless of whether or not it's a bad port. We can still plug a controller in. We can still run it at 30 frames per second or higher, which is something that some consoles don't seem to even be able to get at this point. PCs become something of a Sweden, a neutral ground for console exclusives, and in tiny parentheses at the bottom of the screen, also on PC. 2015 is looking even better, and there are strong signs coming from Windows 10 that Microsoft may indeed commit once again to PC gaming, although don't necessarily count on it. There are plenty of games that I would like to see on the platform, but of course, platform exclusivity wars seem to prevent that from happening. Honestly, the one I'd like to see the most would be Halo Master Chief Collection. As I said before, it's an ideal time to bring it to PC. It's a lovely collection of all four remastered with better graphics. We have been starving for Halo titles, and it's not like they're bad, they're good first-person shooters. They'd be ideal on PC. They're some of the few console shooters that don't seem to suffer from the same problems as the popular modern military nonsense. You can open your own doors in Halo games, you have larger expansive environments, and you have great skill-based multiplayer as well that, to some degree, harkens back to the arena shooters of old, if somewhat slower. Halo was born to be on PC, and then it was kidnapped by Microsoft. It's grown up in their tender loving arms, but I fear perhaps that it is suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, and perhaps it's about time to let the beast loose and let it decide its own fate from here on in. I would love to see that game make its way to PC, and let's see if 2015 brings that. There we go, folks. My first Arbitrary Awards. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for giving us a great year on the channel. I realize that we've been lighter on content this year due to the health problems that I've been suffering, the surgery and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully that will be over within the next few months, and I look forward to 2015 being perhaps our most successful year yet. I'd like to, of course, give big thanks to Christian that helped me with the editing for this video. It was a mammoth project. It took a long time to put together, and I hope that you enjoyed the format. Please do let me know, and of course, if this ends up being successful, we'll try and make it an annual thing. Ideally hope that every single one of you has a great 2015. Happy New Year, and I'll see you next time.